Hey, welcome back to That 70s Card Show. My name is John Keating, and I thank you for joining me as I take a look back at the cards and the culture of the very colorful 1970s. We'll revisit a more simple time in our hobby by taking a deep dive into the sets and stats with a generous amount of dad facts sprinkled in. That 70s Card Show is currently sponsored by nobody. If you have a comment or suggestion, please drop me a line at that70scardShow@gmail.com, 70s Card on Twitter, or that 70s Card Show on the YouTubes. This is episode 73, and this is another riveting volume of the miniseries of the 70s, where I've asked some massively awesome collectors and fountains of knowledge to join me and kind of reveal to me some of their favorite sets from the 70s, dealer's choice, or I guess it's the player's choice. So far, we've gone through the couple of 71 sets and a 76 and 77 Topps basketball with some real pro collectors. This next guy has agreed to come on and help me and share with me his knowledge. And I'll get to the set here in a minute. But one of the things we'd agreed upon is not to show his face. He's going to show his cards. You guys and gals know him as TJMAC Vintage Cards and Nostalgia, but Terry does some most amazing things. I'm going to bring him on here, and we're going to see a couple of the cards he has laid out, and we're going to hear him. Hey, Terry, what's up?
Hey, John, how are you doing?
Good, man. And we've got that strong upstate New York accent going. And as I said, I mean, I don't need to introduce you, Terry, because you have your collection spans the four major sports. Your collection spans the eras, and it's also chock full of fun other stuff that aren't necessarily trading cards. So tell me about young Terry and how he came upon becoming a card collector, if you don't mind.
Sure. I began my collecting journey would be about 1979. I was 5 years old, and I had an older brother, which tends to get us into collecting. I think for a lot of us, we emulate what our brothers do. And my brother was very much into baseball, football, hockey, basketball cards. And the first packs I remember specifically opening were 1979 Topps football.
Okay.
And just that when I see that those cards, I know every one of them. It just resonates with me. And then I really got into collecting more so in 1980. I opened all four major sports that year in 1980. I remember getting the hockey cards with the pucks on them that were blacked out with the
Ridiculous, man.
players' names, and you couldn't even flip the
Ridiculous.
card over. I know, and see
I
the players'
know.
names. So we'd get quarters or dimes. My uncle would buy us packs, and we get our quarters and dimes and scratch them off, and that's
It's
how we
nuts,
learn the
man.
names of the players.
Yeah, you couldn't
Yeah.
tell the team, the position, or the player's name
No, it was
on
a
those things,
mess.
man. Yeah. They were into Tops was into some scratch offs in that period, right? With the baseball ones. I don't know what they were thinking.
Right.
Yeah. So tell me about upstate New York is obviously a football hotbed. What was it like? What was your baseball allegiances towards back then?
So with baseball, my allegiance was the Yankees because my
Okay.
father was a Yankees fan. My grandfather was a Yankees fan. My grandfather was also a Blue Jays fan because the Blue Jays came in '77,
Yep.
and we grew up in the Falls, which is not too far, probably an hour and a half from Toronto. So that's really the closest team to us in the
Did you go to
majors.
games at Exhibition Stadium back then?
I didn't go to exhibition. I actually
Okay.
didn't go to my first game until the Sky Dome,
Okay.
which would have been in the later '80s, believe it or
Right.
not. So I never had been to Exhibition Stadium. I was on the old. I used to go to Cleveland sometimes. The old Mistake on the Lake.
Oh, lucky you,
And
man.
we'd see games there.
Yeah.
And
Football and baseball, or just
just baseball. For
Okay.
football, I'd see the Bills.
Okay.
So that's the only stadium I've been to, still even to this day, is Rich Stadium, which is
Yeah, I
what it
don't
was
know what
called
it's
then.
called these days. I just say Old Orchard Park, right? I
Yeah,
guess
I say Rich Stadium because that's what
Yeah.
it was called for many
I,
years, or Ralph Wilson.
yeah. So, uh, Yeah, well, you know what? I was remiss in saying you're in a football hotbed, but obviously you're in a hockey hotbed as well because
Yes.
you guys love your Sabres up there. But and I've been to the old Odd many times. Crazy, crazy place that was. Um, any basketball? I know we had a Buffalo Braves sighting there. Any kind of that in your past?
I was a little too young for the Braves. They left. I mean, I was alive when they were around, but I was too
Right.
young. My
Okay.
father-in-law, though, went to many, many Braves games, and he would tell me the stories. And he even drove some of the Braves players home one night from a
Okay.
business trip because
All right.
he had won a trip to see the Braves play in New York City,
Right.
and they ended up getting quite a storm, and the players' cars were covered in snow, so he drove a couple of them home.
Oh my gosh.
He used to love to tell that story because it was just his touch with some of the greats on the team.
Was that a
And
like a plane trip back up and then at the airport?
train,
Train.
train,
Okay. Oh
trained to New
wow,
York
that's so
City to see
cool,
the
man.
Knicks. So he saw the Knicks play the Braves in New
At
York
the
City.
Garden, yeah.
Him and his one of his sons, his youngest son. So great
So,
story.
so you touched on you not only boy, you're the five-tool player here. Yeah, your father, your grandfather, an older brother, and then something else that is really completes the package is you married into a collecting family too, or a sports fanatic family, right?
Yes, yes.
I know you talk a lot about that, integrating your collection with your father's and your father's-in-law. Tell me a little bit about that, your father-in-law, maybe.
Sure. My father-in-law was not really a card collector because he was born in the 30s, so that was kind of the dead ball era of cards when he got
Yep.
into the 40s with the war and everything. But he was a very prolific TTMer. I mean, he
Oh
has so
wow.
many TTMs from that area, and he'd get them on the postcards back then. And I have some of them. My
Amazing.
brother-in-law has most of them, but he has Ted Williams, Roy Campanella, Satchel Paige. He loved the Indians, so
Wow.
he's got so many of the Indians
Yeah.
that would sign through TTM on the postcards, and they're all post dated, which is really neat because then you could tie it back to when that signature was actually done. So
Right.
it's not the same as getting a signature at a card show. You're actually getting these guys in their playing days.
Yeah.
Stan Musial, he's got a
Man.
beautiful note from Frank Leahy, coach of Notre Dame, that wrote him
Yep.
a nice letter, and just an incredible collection. But what I mainly have from him are his magazines. He was a big sports fan, read a lot of sport magazines, Sports Illustrated, and from I have his magazines from the late 40s all the way into the early 80s. So just quite a bit of sports history there.
Now help me with that because I know you're a bit finicky with what you collect in the sports magazines, but was your father-in-law getting them through the mail or was he buying them from the newsstands? Because I know
Um,
what your preference is now, but what was the
right. His magazines from 1940 until 1953 were subscription. So
okay.
they have the labels on them.
Hmm.
But I will say this: the subscription issues back then were a lot better than they were later on when they were sticking them everywhere.
Yeah.
Up the sides. They tended to put them, at least when they went to his house, in the left corner, nice and neat, so they didn't really distract too much. But everything he had from the mid 50s, I have an Eddie Matthews from
All
1955
right.
Sport
All right.
magazine on our newsstand issues.
So why didn't they put them on the back, the address stickers? What would the harm be there?
I have no idea. That's a great question. I don't think anybody thought people collected them, so they probably didn't care.
Yeah, but come on,
I agree
man.
with you.
Let's back up a little bit because I'm curious about TTMing in the yonder days. Was that a matter of him sending stuff to the stadiums, or was he actually tracking down addresses of
I
players?
believe he would send them to the stadiums back
Okay,
then. I don't think he had access to the addresses of the players.
okay, I
It
got you.
wasn't that sophisticated as far as
Yeah,
I know.
that's what I was wondering because I know that used to be. I know people still do send stuff to stadiums, but it seems like you end up as part of the machine. But back then, they would actually have people that would make sure fan mail got to the players and all that stuff, which
Yeah,
is
and they would send you back postcards with the pictures of the players, and they would sign them right on the front of the postcard. So I have a scrapbook with these postcards.
so we're eventually here going to talk about the 75 tops football set. But before we do that, I'm going to put you on the spot here with a few things. What is your favorite sport to watch and collect?
My favorite sport to watch nowadays is football, and my favorite sport to collect right now, this present day at this moment, would be football, just because I buy more football probably than I buy any other sport right now.
Are you, first of all, uh, you could plead the fifth here, but are you a full-fledged member of the Bills Mafia, and what is the induction process like? Is it as gory as they say?
Well, here's going to be an interesting story for you. I'm not a full-fledged member of the Bills Mafia. I am a Bills fan, but to be honest with you, I'm more a Cowboys fan than I am a Bills fan.
Oh, this is the end of the episode.
And
So
I'm gonna tell you why that is, and it's
let,
gonna be real easy for you. I was born in 1974.
uh-huh.
Started watching football in 1979. Really got into it in the early 80s, and you could probably testify to this, John. Back then, the Cowboys were on all the time.
Yes.
They were on at 4 o'clock on CBS every
Yep.
Sunday, pretty much, unless they had a Monday night football game. And
Some are all Madden.
right, so I grew up watching that because the Bills were pretty good in the late 70s and even a little bit in the early 80s, but they got terrible in the mid 80s, so they weren't on TV a lot, their home games.
Yeah, for
So
sure.
I became a Cowboys fan through watching them, and the first game I actually went to was the Cowboys versus the Bills in 1984. And the Bills won that game. The Bills were 0-11, and the Cowboys were, I think, 7-4. They would have been going into that game, and the
crazy,
Bills
man.
beat them 14-3. I
Yeah.
remember the first game play from scrimmage. Greg Bell ran an 80-yard touchdown, and they ended up beating the Cowboys. And I was sick. I mean, there were more Cowboys fans than Bills fans in the stadium.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think, that day.
yeah.
And,
But are you considered a disappointment in your family for choosing the Cowboys? Did they
no,
understand?
it's funny because I am the only one. My father's not a Cowboys fan, but I grew up watching football with my father.
Right.
You know how the city houses were back then. A small
Yeah.
house, one TV. I'd be at the bottom of his chair watching the games,
Yeah.
and he would watch the Cowboys because I didn't have direct TV and all that back then.
Yeah.
And I just became a fan through there. But I am a Bills fan now. Like since I got older, I've been a Bills fan. But I like both teams. But I would say I'm more of a Bills fan now, just because I'm more ingrained, obviously, in the city and the sport, and they're always on, and
Right. That's the safe answer, man.
Yeah.
So.
But I have to be honest with you. I'm not gonna pull anything over on you here.
Well, it was America's team back then.
Yes.
And I tend to take the path less traveled. So I was into the Steelers back then because of they weren't the Cowboys. So I understand. We were force-fed teams back in the 70s due to the reasons you say. So, and they still have some of the same rules that were silly. So let's talk football here. What are we going to talk about? What are we going to dive into here?
So, we're going to look at the 1975 Topps football set today. I appreciated you when you reached out to me to say, hey, pick a set that interests you. And I jumped immediately to 75 Topps football. It's my favorite set from the 70s.
And is that, my math is horrible. What year were you born, if you don't mind me asking again?
I was born in 74.
Okay, so it's why 75? Why did we choose the 75 set?
Okay, so for 75 for me, this had to do when I was probably about 13 or 14 years old in the late 80s. My brother got his job, at a local supermarket and started getting the bigger paychecks. And back then, they used to have the card stores in people's basements. You'd find them sometimes, just
right.
father-son type thing.
Yeah.
And I remember going to this gentleman's house. It was a kid I knew in school, and his dad dealt cards. And we'd go in his basement, and he would have these, 5,000 count boxes of 70s and 80s football cards and baseball. And my brother took a couple of his checks and just started buying boxes of these cards. And I didn't have the money he had back then because I was just a poor, 13, 14-year-old. And he would give me his doubles, that he would pull out of the boxes. And I would just sort those cards in front of my television or whatever in the evening. And the 75 Topps were my favorite. I'd have pretty much, I think, from like 73 into the mid 80s. And I just fell in love with the set. Just like the design. And as I grew older, I have better reasons for why I like it. Photography, player selection, some things we could talk more about if you'd like. But
yeah, it's it's a tough thing because you're really into the old vintage cards, which I think they're absolutely gorgeous, and in most cases more gorgeous than the baseball, their counterparts in the 50s and 60s. But 70s football was difficult because there's no logos on the helmets, right? And but it's got some great stuff in there, and it really captures the culture too between the hairstyles, and some of these guys look like they're 65-year-old linemen, and some of them were, I guess, in Bland's case, but they didn't have a lot of competition in 75 Topps. I think there were some Fleer football patches, and some, I guess the bread cards, the Wonder Bread and Town Talk. So there wasn't a lot of competition for tops back then. Um,
Right.
so let's get into some of these cards here. What do you want to talk about?
Sure. So one of the things I want to talk about just is the 75 set overall, and one of the really main reasons why I like it is because, to your point, they didn't have the logos on the players, uniforms or helmets. But what I like about this set is you can look at it and you know it's a football set no matter
Yep.
what photo you see in the set. You can't
Right.
really say that for like 73 tops, for example. There's nothing that tells me it's football on
Right.
the design other than the fact that if a player's got a helmet on or there's a football in his hand or something like that. And 74 got a little bit better because they'd have like a goalpost design.
Yep.
But 75 really, I think, raised the game because they had a flag on the bottom, nice colors, team name prominently displayed. And then I'll just go in a little bit closer here on this Larry Brown. And then you can see here it's got position in the helmet. So I can look at this card no matter if it's a headshot, body shot, or whatever, and know that it's a football card. So that's one of
Right.
the things, first of all, I like. And I do like it's got some color to it, as you can see here in these three
Yeah.
examples from Dolphins, Redskins, and Browns. And that's another area that's favorable to me. And then I just love the variety of photos. And I'm not doing a really good job here showing three action shots, but they have pose shots. You have shots where players are on the sidelines, like for example Archie Manning, Rocky Blyer. You got Burt Jones on the phone.
Right.
Fred Militnikoff. So they have a lot of like natural, I call it setting shots, like during a football game on the
Game day,
sideline.
right? I call those game
Yeah,
day
game
shots
day. That's
because
a good way
whether
of
it's
putting it. Yep.
practice, bench, whatever. But you're right. There's
Right.
game day stuff. There's full action, and there's training camp stuff or whatever.
Yeah, and so they have a great variety. So if you put them in a binder, you have all different types of shots. It's
Yeah.
not the same kind of action shot or the same pose shot that you see all the time. And what sticks out to me in 75 is that the photography starting to get better from what you saw in the early 70s.
Yeah.
And I've read some articles about that from Tops, and they had a lot of independent photographers back then. And most of the articles speak to baseball, not as much football, but I'm sure it's a similar way of doing it. And they would just get files and files of different photos. And what I read was when they would go through them, they could have 40 different photos of a player, and they tried to be they tried to select different types of photos, pose shots, action shots. So there was some method to their madness
Right.
back then, which I appreciate.
Yeah, let's give them a little bit of credit here because football was for card collectors, football was still a little bit down on the list of priorities. Baseball cards uh, dominated the market, so there's some expense involved there because they took all the training camp shots and headshots and poses at training camps. Larry Brown, I'm sure, had dozens taken of them,
Right.
like every other player. But there is an expense there to go and get game day stuff, and then go to the trouble of airbrushing out the logos, except on the Browns card, obviously. But that's an expense. Whereas if you just used headshots or pose shots from a training camp without a helmet, you didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. So I think we have to give them a little bit of credit there, especially
Yes.
for not their their primary market or the primary product, the football stuff. So it's they've really got into their action shots all around in all the sports. I assume hockey's the same way. Hockey was probably a little bit more difficult with the white ice and limited lighting, but yeah, they really embraced the action without having any competition, right? It's not like somebody was breathing down their next to with a better product. So
Yeah, I think they don't get enough credit personally, John. I think we look at things through the lens of today when we look to the past, and that's not always fair to do. They were really doing a lot of experimentation. So this Larry Brown, for example, here, you can see behind him that the crowd's blurred out, and it's
yeah.
something they call the bokeh effect, where they
Right.
try to isolate the player image and blur out the crowd behind him. And I think this is technology that was really emerging around that time in photography, and they're utilizing it in this particular card.
Right.
And I've talked about this card in my channel. It's one of my favorite cards in the set because Larry Brown was deaf in one ear, and Vince Lombardi picked up on it when he was coaching the Redskins in the early 70s. So he put a device in his ear so he could hear the plays come in.
That's amazing, huh?
And he didn't
Wow.
cut him. He didn't cut
Right.
him. He kept him
Right.
on the team. He became an MVP player. And I always say in this picture, he's standing alone on the field. The crowd looks like it's blurred out. So it's like kind of depicts his deafness a little bit, his loneliness
Yeah,
there.
it's a good
And
point.
I really like looking at cards from that standpoint.
Yeah.
And same here, like you got this Bill Stanfill, try hitting a quarterback like that today.
Is
Good
that Joe
luck.
Ferguson?
It's Joe Ferguson. Yep.
He's getting clobbered, huh?
He's clobbering him there. And just to me, when I see a photo like this, it takes me back to being a kid. And like I said, sitting at the end of my dad's chair and watching these football games, when you see these game action shots, I just love them.
Yeah.
And then my favorite card in the entire set, I just picked this one up recently, is this Greg Pruitt.
Right.
You can just feel the sense of fear. Like I like to think in his eyes with Mean Joe Green bearing down on him there. And in this game was played in 1974, I believe, and it's the only game that Mean Joe Green scored a touchdown in.
Oh, is it really?
It was in this Browns game, and that's what I like about these cards too. When you have the one team on them, it's not like baseball where they play so many games; it could be a little harder to figure out which game it's from.
Yeah.
Football's not that hard. You can just go, and then you can even go online and do some research and see photos from the game.
Yeah, we know it's Cleveland.
Exactly.
It's on grass, and
yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I looked up the box score, and I'm like, hey, Mean Joe Green scored a touchdown and a fumble in that game.
Right.
So
yeah, it's interesting how I used to love Greg Pruitt. I thought he was great. Right, he's a great running back, and then a player taking up more space on Greg Pruitt's card, and Greg Pruitt is a interesting story. And I think I always joke about the worst rookie card ever, which is I think the 74 Ray Guy.
Yes.
Where you can't see Ray, you can barely see Ray Guy.
Yes.
It almost reminds me, the violence of football and how close quarters, except for what you say, Larry Brown, who's isolated there, which was a brilliant analogy. So it's, it sums all of that up. It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
What else you got from there? You got anything else that you want to show us from?
Yeah, let's see. There's another card that I really like a lot.
You have the whole set, by the way?
I don't have the whole set, believe it or not. No,
Okay.
I just target cards based on what I like, and
Right.
I had the whole set years ago, but
Okay.
I don't really have any football sets. I just pick what I like. And baseball,
Okay.
I do have sets, but not football. Here's a nice Fran Tarkenton card from the set. Nice game action shot, and I just love the purple on this.
Yeah, we in the Rams, I guess. That's who we're playing there.
Yep, that's
Okay.
right. You can see the edge of the player there. So this is a great card. And then I'm going to show you another one here.
Probably I don't know, man. He's a guy who kind of straddled a couple of eras there, but Tarkenton was, lumped the 60s and the 70s together. He's probably the best combined quarterback of those two decades.
I would agree with that 100%. And because he played in the early 60s and he played until 79, I think. His last card was 79.
Giants, right? And then the Vikings, I think.
He went. What's interesting is he started with the Vikings. Okay. He went to the Giants because he fell out of favor with Norm Van Brocklin, who was the Vikings coach at the time. He ran too much, and I think it drove Van Brocklin crazy. So they traded him to the Giants. And then I believe in the Bud Grant era, I'm pretty sure he went back to the Vikings again. So it would have been right around, I'm just going off the top of my head here, I think 71.
Okay.
So then he finished his career with the Vikings. He went to those Super Bowls post Joe Cap, who took him to the first Super Bowl and lost. But he went to those three other ones, and we know how those turned out. He lost those. And but even in his last season, he was very productive. He threw for over 3,000 yards, ton of interceptions, but that was the era. I don't really fault him too much for that.
And that's a great call out because there weren't a lot of scrambling quarterbacks back then, and he was surely one of the first, if not prolific scramblers as an NFL quarterback.
Yeah, and you got to figure too. Norm Van Brocklin was his coach, who was also a quarterback, Hall of Fame quarterback, and he was about one of the toughest son of a guns you're ever going to meet. So I don't think I'd want to play for him if I had a choice.
Gotcha. So Lawrence McCutcheon's on our screen now.
Yeah, so this is the Lawrence McCutcheon rookie card. This is an interesting card because I'm always trying to figure out where's the crowd on this card. You just see it looks like a bunch of empty seats, but this is a Hall of Famer, not McCutcheon, but Chris Hamburger.
Okay.
For the Redskins, is looking to tackle him here, and he's giving him a nice stiff arm. And what's interesting in the 1970s is if you look at the statistics, running backs, I believe, led the league in receptions. I want to say 4 of the 5 years from 75 to 79.
Okay.
So it shows you how different the game was back then.
Yeah.
They would throw a lot of passes to the running backs back then. And for volume, but they go downfield to the receivers for the for the longer yardage gains.
Yeah, different game for sure, and that's why these guys. Who was it? Tarkenton that had the most yards, and then Marino broke his record? I mean, there weren't a lot of quarterbacks
It
racking
would
up
have
the
been
yards, right?
Dan Fouts,
Fouts, right?
and
Okay,
then Marino. But Dan Fouts,
yeah,
it was more late '70s, early '80s.
and that's an open
Once
game. That's Eric Coryell right there.
once
So,
they changed the rules in '78, the Mel Blount rule, and they
hmm
allowed less contact on receivers coming off going down the field. They only could do it off the line of scrimmage. It completely changed the game. You saw the
right,
explosion of passing yards after
yeah,
that.
yeah, gotcha.
That's why you can't compare eras. It's so hard
Yeah,
in football.
for sure. Well, I mean, we know that Jim Brown could run any era, but
That's fair,
yeah, yeah,
but quarterbacking is a little
yeah,
harder.
different. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
What else we got here?
So a few observations I'm just gonna give you from this set that I think are kind of fun. So this is the only set 1975 that has all four of the original members of the Purple People Eaters of the
Okay, that's a good
Vikings.
one. It's a good call out.
So you got of course they were uh, Jim Marshall,
Yep.
and then you had
Page,
Alan Page, and then
Eller,
Carl Eller, and then Gary Larson would be the
Gary
fourth.
Larson. I would
Now
not have gotten Gary Larson. So
Gary
thanks for
Larson's
filling
the
that
one
one in.
that's missing in all the other years, though. He
Okay.
played for 10 years, and this is probably some of the reason why people don't like football cards maybe as much, is he played for 10 years and he never had a card until 1975.
That's
And the
nuts,
funny
man.
thing is, Johnny retired in 1974.
That's
So
funny,
you can
man.
argue he never had a playing days card because
Yeah, right,
he was
right.
retired when his card came out in 75.
And he was a tackle, a defensive tackle,
He
I
was the
assume?
defensive tackle on the Purple People Eaters,
Okay.
right next to Alan Page, and then you had
Okay.
Marshall and Eller on the edges.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, defensive tackles, as we know, football, offensive linemen, and you had to be really good offensive lineman, I think, to get a card every year too, like Ron
Yep.
Yeri or John Hanna, people like that. So yeah,
Yeah.
it was, I talked about this a little bit in with basketball with Mark Hoyle, but the rookie cards too are tough because of the distance of time between the draft and the season. They just didn't have time to put rookies in there. So you end up with a lot of mostly second year rookies, sometimes older rookies than that, like probably Rocky Blyer is an older rookie here, right?
Right.
Is
Yes.
and I think it's, according to Beckett, out of the 529 cards, there's 77 rookies in there. You want to tell us who the biggest banger is in your opinion?
So the biggest rookie in this set to me would probably be either the Dan Fouts or the Lynn Swan.
Yeah,
Would probably
yeah.
be the two biggest. But some of the other rookies, you got Mel Blount in there. Obviously one of the best corners of the '70s.
Yep.
Cliff Harris, who's the Hall of Fame safety with the Cowboys, and then you had his mate there in the backfield, and Charlie Waters, his
Mhm.
rookies in the set. You got This is really interesting in the set. You have probably three of the best receivers of the '70s. The only one I would argue that might be in there with him is Harold Carmichael, but you have
Right.
Drew Pearson,
Uh-huh.
Cliff Branch, and Lynn Swan,
Yeah.
all in that set as rookies.
And you mentioned Fouts, who, for those of us of a certain age, Fouts was nobody threw like Fouts. He could, he had two great receivers, and he had a great tight end, and that guy would rack up the yards. But also, Joe Theismann rookie card is in there, right? I think
It's his first NFL card. He has a
first
CFL
NFL,
card. It's kind of like
right?
Warren Moon. He had some
Yep.
CFL cards, but you're correct. It's his first NFL card.
Yeah, I'll run down just a couple names: Swan, Blyer, Fouts, Theismann, Blunt. I like to call him Blunt.
Yeah,
Pearson,
I think you're right.
Yeah, Cliff Branch, Ernie Holmes, another Steeler. Cliff Harris, like you said, Charlie Waters, right? Jim Youngblood and McCutcheon's rookie, as you say. But a lot of rookies in there, a lot of Hall of Famers in there. Let me see how many Hall of Famers. It says that there's 91 of them on cards, and that includes leaders and stuff like that. So stone cold Hall of Fame killers are in there too. Those great guys from the '70s. You mind if I talk about the old man in the set here?
Sure.
First of all, I'm going to bring up a couple slides here. Wax pack there. Cello pack has Tom Dempsey actually in that cello pack, which is kind of cool. See here, there's the football packaging, 15 cents. I'm not sure. You probably got 10 cards, I would imagine, at that point. Checklist, nice and simple. A couple checklists in there. And leader cards and all pro cards. So we brought up Tarkenton and Stabler. I mean, these are '70s through and through, Ken Stabler. And then McCutcheon was your rushing leader in 74, but we also have his rookie card, which is fun, right?
Yes.
That would completely blow people's heads up these days. Like, how can you have a rookie card the year after you led the league in rushing? It's just the way it was back then. But George Blanda is in there, right? And what's the oldest George Blanda card you have, Terry?
I have his rookie 54 Bowman,
Isn't that
but
crazy?
yeah,
Yeah.
but he actually was in the league about 4 years before that.
So and part of the reason why he has cards 7 and 8 and is because there was just not enough room on the one card to put all his stats and or biography in there. You know why he didn't play in the middle of his career one year? Because I'm looking at his stats and it
Yeah,
says
yeah,
did not play.
he
Then
was
he was
released from the NFL for 1 year, and then he latched on to the AFL in
gotcha.
1960.
There you go.
That's why he fell out of favor in
It's amazing.
Chicago.
I wonder what he did in that interim that year.
Yeah,
Just doing whatever. Swan rookie. Franco Harris, who just passed away, great card there. It's one of those game day cards that we talk about him on the bench. Just love that. And I like to bring up cards. Stan White. Stan White, a Hall of Famer? I'm not sure if he is or not.
no, he's not.
Probably not. But anyway, that's the way football players looked in the 70s. Mustaches, neck guards, massive shoulder pads, all that stuff. And then Fred Cox, right? Now, the reason I bring up Fred Cox is because, first of all, his head always barely fit into that helmet of his, and he had the single bar, but he is the inventor of the Nerf football, which I think is important to always call out. So I never missed that opportunity. And then the Bears had a couple. Here's those poses we talk about. The Bears, I guess, had a photo day at Soldier Field, and I love the old Soldier Field columns in the back, and then Bob Asher, like I've said before, looks like Christmas Vacation cousin Eddie. So not only did it have great action shots and game day shots, but there were some pretty awesome portrait shots as well. What else you got for us? You got anything you want to talk about the set?
Yeah, just so just getting back to what I think is interesting about 70 sets in general, and you can point to 75, is that there were a lot of kickers and punters in sets back in the 70s, and that was at the expense of other positions like linemen, like you said, is because the kicking game was a big deal, more so than it is today back then. And I think again, it's looking at things from the time that it took place and not looking at it from today. As kickers in the NFL, it still matters, of course. We know
Right.
punting not as much though, right? A lot of teams go for it on fourth down
good
now.
point.
Field position was so important back then, so you'd see cards of the punters back there back then on the cards a lot more, like John James with the Falcons, and you can see a picture of him punting on his card. So I think that was a big piece of it. The other thing is I find interesting about the set is there's one guy that has a brush cut in the entire set. It's
Okay.
Larry Seipel. I don't have his card. I wish I did,
Okay.
but you can look it up. Larry Seipel with the Dolphins, and he was a punter. And you can see him there with his brush cut. And I'm like, I'm laughing because I looked at the set the other night in preparation for this. I'm like, there's not another player that has a brush cut. So he really stands out.
Yeah, and he had. That's all I remember is Larry Seipel with that haircut.
Yeah.
There's also, I don't know whether it's Ernie Holmes, but there's a arrow mohawk side shot, portrait shot, and which is kind of cool. You can almost see that. If you go over it real quick, you can't tell, but if you spend some time on his card, you could tell he had an arrow mohawk.
Yes.
Either the beginnings or the you just shaved it off or something, but. You bring up a good point about punting and kicking. Kicking was a pretty big deal back then. A lot of the kickers were, I know there's kickers that are big time gamers these days, but man, it seemed like we knew the name of every kicker back then.
I agree.
Your premium and all those guys, and punting, again, that's another good call out because it was about field position. Although I've mentioned in the past, is there anything in sports that signifies failure more than having your punter on the field, right?
Right.
There's nothing I can think of, right? It means you failed, and the more times you see a punter, the more times you failed. Yet we glorify them on cards and put them in the Hall of Fame, but it was an important part of the game. I think your punting leaders in '74, it says, were Tom Blanchard and Ray Guy. So Ray Guy, obviously in the Hall of Fame and deservedly so, but Yeah, it was a different game. That's for everybody. I consider everybody mutters, right? It seemed like every field was dirty with grass,
Yes,
like Cleveland or whatever. It's
and the turf wasn't very good quality
turf
back
wasn't great.
then.
Yeah,
And but I kind of view punting too as a little bit of a chess match too back then. Like yeah,
true.
you're right, it's a failure, but you're looking to pin your opponent down. You're not scoring as much back then. The games were a lot lower scoring
Right.
compared to today with the way the rules are. But so I kind of view. I think some coaches maybe took that viewpoint as well. Like, hey, we're going to punt here, pin them down, get the ball
Yeah.
back. If they make a mistake and do a bad punt, and then we can maybe score.
Yeah. Did we have the fair catch back then? Do you think?
I believe so. I'm not
Okay.
positive when it came in. That I don't know for sure.
I wonder how many people had to get carted off the field before
Yeah,
they came up with that one, right?
yeah.
Just like we're going to wave our hand in the air. The Eagles kicker or the Eagles returner right now. I swore to my brothers that he was going to have rotator cuff surgery in the offseason. He's called for so many fair catches this year. It's a lost art. Like I don't know who the best returners are anymore. I would guess the last great one was probably Devin Hester. I don't know whether we're going to see that anymore.
Yeah, they
So
want it out of the game.
yeah,
So
yeah, for sure. Anything else you got before? I know you have a time crunch here. Anything else you want to say before I gently grab your arm and walk you towards the door?
just really with the set, another card that I wanted to point out too, and again, I don't have it in front of me, but just for those listening, want to look it up. Even the Jim Otto card is pretty cool in the set
Oh
because it
yeah,
shows the double zeros very
yeah,
distinctly on the front of his uniform, and it's just a memory of him that's ingrained in my head is just those double zeros
yeah. That's a
that
good point.
that he wore,
Yeah,
and
for mighty Raiders.
yeah, and just for me, it's like when it comes to collecting, that's my eye. That's what I look for. I love art and
Right.
cards and photography, and I believe like the early '50s and that was a great era of the art card with the Bowman issues and even some of
Uh-huh.
those early Tops issues. But I think the '70s are an underrated era in photography
Yep.
because there are some beautiful photographs, and I think as the era goes on, the photographs get better. In my
Yeah,
view.
because those who were trained to take those pictures were typically newspaper people. So we had a lot of used to black and white. I mean, there were some sports magazines around, but it really was. I emphasize it too much, but it was incredibly difficult to shoot without a digital cameras. We're so spoiled right now.
Yes.
You really didn't know what you had until you went into the dark room and and one of the things back then, I don't know whether you remember, I think in baseball and or football, all the sports is you'd have runners that would run that film back to the various uh, news news buildings and have them developed. It was like a real deal.
Yes.
It was like the Pony Express. Get that thing back to the headquarters so we can print some pictures. So
Yes. So yeah, I was just gonna, basically finish up with John. For me too, is like when I'm collecting a set, like 75 is a great set. I love the look of the cards, as I said, the photography, and to your point, some of those photographs were not easy to get back then, like that Greg Pruitt, for
right.
example, and the McCutcheon. So I credit those photographers for doing a good job, and Tops for inserting them into the sets. But the other thing too is when I'm looking at my sets and why I like the 75, I think it's a great year in football too. Is and maybe a little biased because I'm a Cowboys fan, but you had Cowboys Steelers Super Bowl that year, and the Cowboys were not expected to be a very good team that year. They were expected to have a down year, but they had an
Hmm.
excellent draft,
Right.
and they ended up getting to the Super Bowl that year. Bob Lilly retired in
Right.
'74. He has a card in the
He's got a
'75
card.
set.
Yep. Yep.
So for me, that's an added connection is that Super Bowl, Lynn Swan's performance. You got his rookie
Yep.
card in the set. And I always like to picture myself, and it's a little harder to do with football because to your point, it could be a few years removed before a card of a player gets in a
Yeah.
set. But you had Lynn Swan, making a superstar of himself in that Super Bowl. And you have kids opening the packs and getting his cards that year. It's just
Yeah.
those connections that I like to put myself back in as a collector. And that's why I like the magazines too, because you can take yourself back to the era and understand how it was being reported at that time versus a book, which is reporting on the history um, of that time, not
Yeah.
necessarily exactly what was happening. Um, so
Yeah.
that's just another added feature for me for 75.
Yeah, I say go back and on the YouTube and watch some old football games. It'll be fun to watch, folks. It really was a different game, different time. It was not in high def, so it was might be a strain on the eyes, but it was really cool to watch these players. These guys were true warriors, that's for
Yep.
sure.
A lot more running.
Yeah. So I'm going to wrap up here. Stick around. And then when I hit the end record button, I'll say goodbye to you in a more intimate manner. But Terry, thank you so much for joining me. And thanks for joining me on my journey back in time. Again, if you have a comment or suggestion, criticism, if you want me to donate to your cause, just drop me a line at ThatSeventiesCardShow at gmail.com, 70s Card on Twitter, or That 70s Card Show on YouTube. Terry Mac's channel is amazing. I think you all should get over there. You want to give that a quick plug, Terry?
Sure. My channel is TJMAC, Vintage Cards and Nostalgia. And I usually put out one video a week, and I just show cards off in my collection and magazines and just talk about my connection to them.
And it's great stuff. Lots of information given, and lots of information even for someone with a small brain like me that I actually can retain. So on the podcast, we have music by Mango Safari. Enjoy collecting, and more importantly, enjoy your collection. Have a great week, everyone. Goodbye.